Well, and take it to its logical extreme. If institutional knowledge is really important, how can we dare have elections every couple of years or every 2 years? The entire
Right.
Congress, were our founders crazy? The entire Congress is up for election, which means if they were competitive elections and we had a better process, that you could change the whole legislature.
Institutional knowledge is something that we lose, and that would be a bad thing if we have term limits.
They won't be able to find the bathroom.
Hi, this is Scott Tillman. I'm the National Field Director with U.S. Term Limits, and I'm here today with Paul Jacob with the Liberty Initiative Fund. That you're going to get a bunch of noobs who don't have a clue what's going on, and they're going to come in and they're just going to, be tripping over themselves and not be able to figure out how to go introduce themselves to the guy in the next office and how to go talk to other people from the other party and how to actually work through any real problems because they won't even have a clue and they won't know the real problem.
And they'll be easy picking for lobbyists who will be shrewd and get all the goodies. And what's funny about that, in a sense, is that that's what's happening right now with the most experienced, career Congress. That's what we're all concerned about, is that they get worked all the time. In other words, the long tenure and the so-called institutional knowledge seems to equate with having the knowledge of how to play the system for your gain and for the gain of your cronies and any special interest that you have a relationship with and so on. Cronies.
Yeah, and we can see that, especially for their own self-interest, how many people get elected and suddenly they become, great Warren Buffett style investors who are getting a 20+% return every year. They just, the institutional knowledge really seems to be paying off for them.
That's called insider knowledge. and of course, it's illegal for business people to trade stocks on that sort of insider knowledge. But of course, congressmen are making decisions and seeing things happen that will have huge impacts on different things. There was recently when there was I say in the last year or so, a healthcare vote. You had people dumping their healthcare stocks, and we have a huge problem. And one way to go at it is to try to fix all the different, you can't do this and you can't do that, and we better control it. But the truth is, it's like trying to, put your finger in 60 zillion, holes in the dike. There're just too many. And what you need are people who aren't there to make a career, who are there for a short period of time. And of course, will they be more susceptible to the lobbyists? No. Now, maybe we'll elect somebody who's not as sharp as they should be, and they'll get taken advantage of. Right now, we have people, we're electing pretty sharp people, I think, generally. Sometimes we elect somebody who, I'd question that. But that's not our problem. Our problem isn't sending dumb people there. Our problem is that the longer they're there, the more they work with special interests, and the less they seem to represent us. And the other thing about institutional knowledge is it's almost this sort of, hey, if you don't keep sending me to Washington, if I know anything that would help the country, I'm not going to tell you. We've always said, nothing stops the new guy from picking up the phone and calling the former rep and saying, hey, there's a question here. And of course, it is helpful to know stuff about government. But it's like if you're looking for a salesman to sell, cars, and maybe this guy has sold something else, airplanes, he's going to have a learning curve on figuring out cars. But you're not looking for someone who's an expert in cars so much as someone who's an expert in selling them in that particular case. In the case of a congressman, you're not looking at someone, trying to find someone who's an expert and who can go to Washington and go into some place of business and say, oh, no, you need to put the sheets over here and not over there, and the whatever reports that have to be filed. Or we're not looking for people to micromanage the government. We're looking for people to represent how the public sees that government, how they want it changed, what they like and want to continue. In other words, This is a really unique job in society. It's not like a doctor or a lawyer or a plumber or a ditch digger or a gardener, or all of whom are going to learn more about that as they go. This is about representing other people. And it's not an expertise thing. And we do want them to learn about the government, but that's secondary to representing us.
You know, our congressmen and our senators all get elected to go and represent the people's interest in Washington, D.C. But the longer they stay there, the more they start to represent different constituencies. You don't, we hear about this a lot, and I was going to say you don't, but you do. You do hear about it in this way. You hear that Congressman X has been a great friend of the Department of Education, and Congressman Y has been a great friend of, Pakistan or Israel or South Africa or any of, a bunch of other different things. When in their position as congressmen, everything they should be doing should be, are my constituents being served well by the Department of Education? Are my constituents being served well by our national defense? Are my constituents being served well by our trade policy? Not, I'm an expert on trade policy and I've learned how to be really good at representing the different interests in trade policy. Are your constituents being represented well by that? Not the multinational corporations that hold fundraisers and do bundling events for you.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
The longer they stay in Washington, and it's just the nature of it, is you become friends with the people you see often. There's studies that say if you are going to the same place, the same people for, once a week, that's how you make relationships. That's why so many of us have long-lasting relationships from grade school and college and early jobs in our careers, because we're going to and visiting with those people in the same way. And if we send somebody to DC, when they first get to DC, their longstanding relationships are from back in the district. But over time, their longstanding relationships become people who they deal with on DC on a regular basis. And it's going to be natural. It's not that they're somehow awful people or somehow that they are out there to, fleece the American people. They're just going to start to be friends with and to represent those constituencies rather than the constituencies who sent them to Washington, D.C. And then you have the incumbent advantage that makes it almost impossible to unseat somebody unless they really do something very awful.
Well, and take it to its logical extreme. If institutional knowledge is really important, how can we dare have elections every couple of years or every 2 years? The entire Congress. Right. Were our founders crazy? The entire Congress is up for election, which means if they were competitive elections and we had a better process, that you could change the whole legislature. And think about, in another video, I mentioned that the first 100 years of the Congress, the average turnover, was 40%. Now, all those weren't people being defeated necessarily. It was people saying, hey, Congress is not a lucrative way to spend my time. I can't afford to be here forever. And
a lot of people went with service in mind. And they went and said, I'm going to go and spend this much time. These are problems that are important to us. And then I'm going to come home and we're going to send somebody else who is from here, who knows the issue, and that we will elect and we will send to make decisions on our behalf. It wasn't that they weren't, I don't feel like lining my pockets or Washington is such a miserable place. It was, I've got other things to do. And I serve my community in different ways.
It was not the kind of money-making job that it is today. Most people going to Congress make more money in Congress than they made before. And that doesn't include the wonderful stock-picking aura that surrounds the Capitol. That's made so many people even more wealthy. But institutional knowledge, look, we live in the information age. If we really are worried that we have to elect the same guy over and over again because he knows everything, and think about a business that would run that way, that this one guy knows everything, so we just have to keep him forever. You want that knowledge to be spread around. If you have a system in which you're making some argument against term limits because, we'll lose institutional knowledge, you've got a screwed up system.
It's
in
an
which
argument for
you're not protecting the knowledge that you should be.
it's an argument for a monarch or a dictator, somebody who, you know, is specially trained to run everything and to make all the decisions for everybody. And
And maybe their kid could be with them growing up, so they would learn it, and then their children, and then their children. I mean, maybe the divine right of kings was not such a bad concept.
You know, North Korea, we can look exactly 3 generations of how to rule, and the only way that they maintain control is to keep everybody dirt poor and keep anybody from coming in and talking to them.
Term limits, not North Korea.
Right. Yeah, it's, you know, I think as a people, at least in the United States, and I would think that most democracies that are democracies or republics that have democratically elected officials most people would feel the same way, that as a people, we don't want specially trained governors. We want to be governed by the people and to send people of the people to solve our, you know, to be there and to answer the questions. Because it's not a cookie cutter thing where you set up a machine and you run and it just runs on indefinitely. There are different problems that arise. There are, you know, foreign intervention. There are trade issues that arise. There's technology that arises that changes the world. There are government decisions that need to be made. You can't just somehow eventually get to the perfect thing and would never need anybody there to make decisions that pop up. But as a people, we've decided that we want, you know, to send representatives of us who are at least somewhat of peers of the general populace to make these decisions on our behalf. And right now we don't have that.
Well, and the people who are dispensing government, the people who work at the VA and are helping veterans, you know, at the hospitals or in the administrative office or Health and Human Services or the military, these people need to have expertise.
Right.
And they should move up. The more expertise, the more you get paid, and the more, you know, that's how that should work. The legislative branch is a different thing. We're not sending people to Congress to dispense government. We're sending them to decide. They're decision makers. And those decisions, the whole point of having them is for them to be representative. And that's the saddest thing, is that the House of Representatives, does anybody feel represented by this Congress? Does anyone, you know, do many people, even if you voted for the person who's serving in Congress, do you really feel like they're representing you? I think, you know, well, look at the approval rate of Congress, and you see we don't feel represented. And there's a lot of other reforms I think that have to happen. Term limits won't solve every problem, but term limits, one, I think, is a reform that across the spectrum people realize that will help, and it's practical. It's simple. It's not complex and easy to circumvent. It makes a lot of sense to do that first, because then I think other reforms are much easier, because you don't have that career mentality that says, oh, that's not going to be good for me. I'm going to be here forever. I don't want to have those limits on my power.
Another thing that comes up in the term limits argument that kind of ties back to the institutional knowledge is that a lot of people seem to buy the argument. A lot of people in power seem to like throwing out the argument and using it with reporters and whatnot, that lobbyists are somehow going to be in charge if we have term limits. And there is
no change.
There's nothing more demonstrably false than the idea that lobbyists will have more power with term limits. And we have great examples of this. It's too bad that nobody's put the measurements on it, because it shouldn't be that hard to do. But in states with term limits like Michigan, we have lobbyists, and the lobbyists go down there every day. And in states without term limits like Illinois and Texas, they have lobbyists also. There's actually, when you walk around and meet the lobbyists, I hadn't noticed this, but I was talking to a gentleman from Michigan named Ken Braun, who you might know, who's been involved with government for a while, and he was involved in the early days before term limits had really taken effect in Michigan, and then he's been involved after. And I said, have you noticed anything different? And he said, I get this argument a lot, and it's pretty easy to spot that it's a lie because, number one, the lobbyists spend more opposing term limits than anybody else, and they bemoan term limits every chance they get. And I'm pretty sure that they're all in it for the money. You might have a few lobbyists that are in there. You have grassroots lobbyists. That might be a different thing. But all the paid lobbyists down there are there. They're not giving away their services, and they spend a lot of money against term limits. And we know that term limits breaks up relationships between.
It makes their job harder. It makes their job, I think, a lot harder because they can't rely on, if you're a lobbyist and you connect yourself and you're buddy with the speaker or a couple committee chairmen and so on, and everyone's staying, not everyone, but the leadership staying for 10, 20, 30 years, that's pretty good for you. You don't want that broken up, and you don't want to have to learn new names every election. Well, the public wants you to have to learn new names because they want new blood. And they want that. They want a system in which you're having to go sell people on the ideas. This bill is good because of this. This bill is bad because of that. And not, hey, Joe, pat him on the back. Remember that, I've been with you, giving you money for 30 years. I'm helping you get reelected. That's not what we want.
No, that isn't what we want. And this is exactly what Ken and I got around to in our conversation. When you look at the crowd of lobbyists, when you go to a state without term limits, what you get is you get a bunch of good old boys. They have been working with those people who are in leadership for decades. Half of them just decided one time at some point that it would be more lucrative for them to resign their position in the legislature and go, lobby.
Right.
And there's a ton of them that have, the majority of that crowd has either come from the legislature or just been tied to and really close to the staffers and the legislators for a long time. And they've got those things. And then you look at a state like Michigan, and you've got only a few of those guys left. Most of those guys have left because the people they had relationships are gone. And instead you have these young 22, just out of college to 40-year-old people, men and women, are getting hired as lobbyists because they're out there and they're aggressive and they're going to go out there and they're learning the issue and they pitch it. And they're very aggressive and they're out there and they know their issues. So when somebody says, well, the lobbyists are going to come in and they're going to be pitching it and they're going to be pitching it hard and they're doing this and that. Yes, they are. In a state like Michigan, a state like California, and a state like Arkansas, they are out there and they are very aggressive. The difference is they don't have the long-term relationship, and they might be as aggressive as they want. But, Steve Johnson gets elected. Steve Johnson's been there for 3 months. Maybe on the outside he gets elected. He's been there for 4 years, and he's going to be there for a total of 6 years. He's got a lot of people back in his district who can just pick up the phone and say, hey, Steve, this bill's coming up. And Steve's like, yeah, this lobbyist's been telling me all about it. And they're like, no, you need the other side on this. And the constituents have much more sway with these guys than the lobbyists do, because the lobbyists don't have the long relationships. Yes, they've got to be aggressive. They got to be there with the facts. They've really got to present it, and they got to make a really strong, solid argument. And at the same point, they're going against constituents who have long relationships built up. The representative is able to call people who've been in that seat before. It's a very, very tough job for the lobbyists as compared to the easy, cheap job that the lobbyists had before. It's amazing in some of these states without term limits, people get busted for, taking bribes. And there was a case, was it South Carolina, where the big headline was the most amazing part of this, bribery circle and whatnot was how cheap they were selling their votes. Legislators are cheap and easy when you have relationships like that. And we got to make the lobbyists work. I mean, you're not going to not have lobbyists. Lobbyists are going to be there.
Right, because a lobbyist just means someone who's going to
act, right?
To advocate, and you want them to be knowledgeable and sharing that knowledge. What you don't want is for them to come first in I like them. They're more my buddy than my constituents, and the longer you're in a legislative chamber for all the reasons we've talked about, the more those are your buddies. And we want people representing us who are one of us, who when they think about a law and the government doing something, think about how that will impact them, not how how the public will react. I think a lot of times politicians are looking at the public as somebody else, not them. And the more term limits are in effect, and term limits that are short enough where you're not becoming a career politician, the more they're going to look at things from the standpoint of the citizenry as opposed to the others.
Are you familiar with this author, Peter Schweitzer?
Yes.
So he's looked into a lot of the stuff in DC, and he writes about it in a lot of his books, and not just Republicans and not just the Democrats. He goes through both sides, but talking about, why you vote for it just because this guy's had a relationship with you for 30 years or whatever, as opposed to having to go in there and make the case. I mean, we want the lobbyists to have to work hard. They should have to come in and really hard, pitch that case hard. It shouldn't be like the cases that he points out where the congressman's son works at this lobbying firm, and my company that wants this deal goes to this lobbying firm and pays them $800,000. And then,
Right.
lo and behold, the congressman is all on board with it, not because we've gone and pitched him real hard, but because we paid the company that his son works at, or that his best friend, or that his former staffer. There's this revolving door issue in Washington.
And think about you could try to somehow regulate that, and they have. But what are you going to say, that if you're the son of a congressman, your employment opportunities aren't there? When Senator Daschle was the Democratic Majority Leader from South Dakota, this is a decade ago or so, his wife was a lobbyist for all kinds of different interests. And, and they tried to kind of say, and I'm sure to some small degree, maybe it was possible that, well, we don't talk about it at home, and she doesn't directly lobby me. But, that if American Airlines needs something and you're a Democrat and you would like to be a committee chairman, but there's a bill where you think maybe American Airlines ought not get what it wants, do you think that's going to help you with Daschle or maybe hurt you? And if you think about it, all of a sudden that is an influence. And the truth is, if you think about it that way, if Daschle and his wife were had been perfect in every way, it had never influenced them in any way. Just the appearance of it would influence other people.
Yeah.
And so it is. And of course, if Daschle were going to be in Washington for a very short period of time, his wife might not be in that profession. Well, because it's a tough profession to be in if you're only going to be in Washington for 6 years or 8 years. And she could have done it in South Dakota or somewhere else. But the more the longevity allows all of these relationships to grow and fester, and even as is, you kind of see it again and again. Yes, there can be corrupt intent, and it's terrible. But even when there's not corrupt intent, it tends to corrupt over time. It tends to change people's allegiances and their thought patterns. And look, people are self-interested. We're not going to change human nature because we pass some law. But
we can hedge against it with term limits.
Yes, and that's what term limits, and that's what the founders were all about. That's why we have 3 branches.
Right.
There's nothing magical about the number 3. They wanted the competing forces so that no branch of government would assume all power. And term limits is kind of the same way. We don't want someone entrenching themselves in power, and it's not as if it hasn't been tried. When you think about this idea that somehow, we couldn't run government. Well, look at all these states that have term limits now for their legislature for 20 years, and you look at all kinds of different lists. I know a lot of my friends, anytime a new list comes out of the 50 states, I look at it for how the term limit states do. They do very, very well. And maybe they did very well before. But they are doing very well. The idea that somehow term limits are a disaster, that's not what the public thinks in every state that has them.
You still have corruption in states with term limits. The difference is it's shorter corruption. Nobody's standing up to get fired and defend you when you're going to be there for 6, or if you get elected to the House in Michigan 6 years and then 2 Senate terms, you might be there for 14 years. Nobody's going to give up a 20-year career to defend you for doing stupid stuff when they can stick around, ratting you out. And we see corruption in states with term limits, but it's always this short-term, get found out quick, because
Right.
for one thing,
Right.
they're more amateur at it. That they don't know how to game the state budget over.
Yes, and they don't have all the co-conspirators lined up as well as they might otherwise. And in fact, really the worst corruption that I can think of in a state with term limits is the state of Arkansas, where 7 legislators have been indicted and convicted, I believe. Maybe it's just indicted. A number of them have been convicted, but I think it actually is 7 that fit both of those. And it came after, it began with folks who ended up putting a phony ballot measure on to weaken the term limits to 16 years, tricked voters into doing it, tricked them into voting for it in part because it had a gift ban, which was a phony gift ban. They still get all kinds of gifts and free meals and everything else. But that whole effort was led by one of the people who's been indicted, convicted, and is serving, I believe, an 18-year term for fraud to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so you see that it's that same drive to be career politicians behind the folks who are committing the corruption there. So
Right.
To me, it's very interesting. You're right that overall there've been this and that very small scale stuff. The biggest instance has been in Arkansas, and it's come from the very people who were expanding term limits, cheating voters.
And even that case in Arkansas, I don't even think they were talking about more than a couple $100,000 between what was actually, the effect of what they were trying to give away in state money and whatnot. It was very small potatoes. But you look at scandals that have been found out in Chicago, in New York, and in
New York, you saw the Senate president and the Speaker of the House both go to prison.
Yeah.
Massachusetts, Massachusetts, after the court struck down the term limits passed there, the 3 following speakers all went to jail. And of course, both of us have spent our time in Illinois, which has incredible.
These guys aren't going to jail because they made some decision in the last cycle and they took a bribe in their last whatever. They're going to jail for stuff they've been doing for decades, for the most part, for running city and state contracts to their friends, getting kickbacks on equipment, kickbacks on what the jobs pay, giving patronage, other things.
Right.
It goes on for decades and decades in these states, as opposed to when you look at the term limit states. I mean, it's all short term and small potato stuff compared to billions and billions in states without term limits.
Well, it's interesting.
In Washington, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned Arkansas. After term limits passed, one of their 20, 30-year incumbents was then found out, partly, I think, because he no longer could wield power over people indefinitely, that people started to come out and whisper about what he was doing. But his name was Nick Wilson, and he had a huge kickback scheme through the prison system. And these are the kind of things that, as you point out, if you're there for a term or 2 or 3, you don't have time to set up some elaborate kickback scheme that involves the entire state prison system. And
no, but the guy who comes after you, he's not going to keep making sure that money goes to you. He's going to take it for himself and cut you out of the business, or throw you under the bus, or to throw you under the bus and take the political credit for finding the corruption. I mean,
yeah,
the shaking it up makes a big difference. Scott Tillman, U.S. Term Limits, Paul Jacob, Liberty Initiative Fund, talking term limits and talking about the different ways that institutional knowledge is most often used to game the system rather than used to benefit the constituents. Thanks for being with us today, Paul. For more information on term limits, go to termlimits.com.